Well, the federal carbon tax increased yesterday in provinces that don't have their own carbon pricing plans. So did the rebate that goes along with it. The Prime Minister says he's willing to listen to any plans that meet federal pollution pricing targets, but some provinces are still pushing back.
With the Supreme Court judgment, it is clear that there needs to be a price on pollution right across the country. Any province has been welcome for years now to put forward a plan that meets the federal targets.
There are other ways for us to be able to achieve the outcomes that the federal government wants to achieve. The carbon tax has been tried, it's failed, it's punitive, people don't like it, especially in the middle of an affordability crisis. It's got to go.
This carbon tax has to go, or in a year and a half, the Prime Minister's going.
Okay, so who's going to win these political battles over consumer carbon pricing? That's the next topic for the Power Panel. Kate Harrison, Françoise Boivin, Michelle Cadario, and Emily Nicola. Michelle, we heard what Doug Ford had to say. That's quite the pronouncement from the Premier of Ontario. Tim Houston, the Premier of Nova Scotia, has bundled together a series of climate plans that they're executing in Nova Scotia and said, look, this is better than a carbon price. We should be exempt. And Wab Kinew of Manitoba is apparently coming to the table with something similar to that. Where do you think that goes? Because it doesn't sound like it's going to include carbon pricing in any of its form, either through a levy or through cap and trade.
Well, you know, with the Prime Minister putting out the challenge to the premiers, it is interesting that, and as expected, I guess, that provinces are going to step up and put forward what their plans are. But what they're doing is already baked into the numbers that we have. Mm-hmm. I don't see, I haven't seen the full detail, and maybe those will come forward. But are there extra measures that are going to make up that delta or that gap that taking away a carbon tax would do? And I think that's what the challenge is that the Prime Minister put to all the provinces. Each one in their letters also said very clearly how big of a challenge and how big of an existential crisis essentially that climate change is, and that we all do have to be tackling it. So, now how are they going to do that if they think that they can do it better? I think that it'll be a lot of words and it will be a lot of reiterating what they're already doing. And as I said, that already is baked into the existing plan. It was very interesting, though, to hear, something dug up from Danielle Smith from just a few years ago, talking about how great the carbon rebate was and how much more that Albertans were getting back rather than paying at the pumps. And I don't know why it took so long for that to surface, but it is pure gold. And I'm sure it will be on mass repeat as much as possible as we get out there and into it. But, so far, someone like Dennis Smith hasn't put an alternative on the table. Neither has Doug Ford. Let's see what they have to say.
Well, it's funny that you should mention that because we did want to show that because this is something the Liberals have found to great glee as they have been getting pummeled on carbon pricing for a while now. They dug up this clip that Michelle talked about of Danielle Smith from speaking with the Fraser Institute in 2021. They've been sharing it on Twitter like crazy. Just have a look.
I do my family's taxes, so I know we got $808.50. We get an extra little bump for me and my husband because we live in a rural environment. And when I go back and look at what I spent last year in carbon taxes, because I was working from home, I wasn't commuting, my gas bills were way down, and even the amount of tax that I paid on my home heating, because we're principally natural gas where I live, I would say that I probably ended up better off with that transfer.
Okay, Françoise, now look, there's some context around that. She's working from home during the pandemic. It's a different sort of thing. She says she was comparing it, she said today, to the provincial NDP pricing system that Rachel Notley's government had put in place. But that's an interesting economic analysis there from the Premier of Alberta. Does that change anything in this conversation?
Well, it will make for some interesting exchange in the House of Commons when the guys come back next week. That being said, I'm not so sure that the battle of communication on the price on pollution is not already won by the Conservative in some aspect because it's such a simple message. Axe the tax, axe the tax. Now you've got Premier Ford jumping in, who will be, I think, in an election, in a campaign before Justin Trudeau. So it will be interesting to see. And he doesn't want to wear the situation. So he has to distance a bit himself from the governing Liberals, because he looks so chummy for the longest time. But for many people, it's still a big question mark. What does it all mean when the Prime Minister says, bring me a plan? To compare with what exactly? Because to this day, and I don't consider myself an expert on price on pollution, on carbon tax, and so on and so forth, and the rebate, I did get that point now that we've talked about it. So I think 3 weeks in a row so far. So now I got that point that Danielle Smith seemed to have gotten before me in 2021. But in when you compare plans, what do you compare, and exactly what do the Premier have to come with to be sufficient in the eye of Stephen Guilbeault? Because yes, they're right. The Supreme Court gave them that they do have the jurisdiction to do so, set a price on pollution. But that being said, what's the minimum? How do you achieve that? How do you prove that? You've got all type of experts. Those aspects are not clear in my mind, and I'm sure in a lot of mine, and that's why a lot of people go to the simplest thing, which is just to say, you know what, let's just axe the tax, which is not helping the environment and our planet one bit.
Well, Françoise, you got the point, but Kate Danielle Smith got the rebate, and she said it was more than she paid in that particular year. And look, whatever they come back with, it can't just be emissions reduction on energy generation side. There has to be a price on carbon in some fashion to comply with the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Act. And that's why Quebec has cap and trade, BC has its own carbon price. None of the objecting premiers are proposing anything like that. And we're going to talk to Don Drummond and Steve Gordon later in the show, two of the economists who signed a letter who say that's a problem because you can't hit the targets without it.
Yeah, and so you're right. It is by design that there be some type of a price. And so I think what a lot of premiers are now contesting is, of course, okay, maybe we need to revisit that act overall and entertain these options. I think Françoise said, you know, she's not a price on pollution expert, neither am I, neither are most Canadians. And so what I think this will turn into is probably the tabling of a number of ideas from premiers. Well, what about certain technologies? What about, you know, helping pave the way to more alternatives that exist? And if the dynamic is ideas from the provinces that don't include a carbon tax, and Ottawa saying no repeatedly, we insist on a carbon tax, I think provinces are okay with that being the dynamic. Yes, does it not meet the federal criteria? It won't. But I think provinces are taking a gamble based on public opinion, and you know, I think probably the right gamble, that they will hear the public. They will see their ideas kind of repeated back to them in the public. Well, what are some of the alternatives? They're tabling the alternatives. Justin Trudeau dared them to. They've said they've decided to play the game of chicken. And so I think that that's a dynamic the premiers would welcome. We've got all these ideas that don't involve a tax. If Ottawa says it's tax or bust, I don't think Canadians are generally going to respond well to that.
But you know, Emily, no one has put out a robust actual proposal. What Nova Scotia has taken is a climate plan from 2022, an energy plan from 2023, a hydrogen plan, which is largely aspirational, from December, and a coastal action plan from February. And that doesn't get the country to where it needs to go. And if everyone just does what is bare minimum for their jurisdiction, if we're going to hit these national targets, that's going to put an extra burden on Alberta. That's going to put an extra burden on Saskatchewan, because they're the carbon-intensive provinces right now. So how do you think this plays out if none of the premiers are coming with anything that specifically measures emission reductions, and the experts out there say you need some sort of pricing or it's just not going to work?
I think it's already playing out in a way that elevates the conversation, in a sense that, for example, now we can know that the federal government is talking about price and pollution, and Nova Scotia responded with things that, for example, have to do with climate adaptation, which is really, really important, but has nothing to do with reducing green gas emission. And so there's all of basically the different words that have climate on it: climate reduction, climate change reduction, climate adaptation, price pollution. Most Canadians at this point are not necessarily making the difference, or at least the premiers are banking on the fact that the population is not making the difference. So it's just green stuff, right? Green transition, green whatever. And so the government is asking the provinces to come up with green plans, and the provinces are saying, here is our green ideas that have nothing to do with the price and pollution. But at the same time, it starts a conversation. It starts a conversation on what the provinces are doing, that is green policy in general, and what the federal government could do more to help them with that. Even it has nothing to do with carbon pricing. And that's actually another interesting conversation to have. And also, it puts the onus on Ottawa to be okay. But what about pricing the pollution? How are you also going to do that? And so it starts a back and forth. Pierre Poilievre is saying today we should have a meeting with all the premiers across the country in Ottawa, which of course would be a terrible idea for the federal government. What the federal government loves to do is do one-on-one negotiation. And so if it starts off a series of one-on-one conversation with the premiers on green transition, I think that's already a win in terms of where the conversation in Canada was even 3 months ago, which is just axe the tax, axe the tax, axe the tax. And we'll see as well the provinces that do not want to have anything to do with green anything. And I will say that when we look at the carbon tax, the carbon gas emissions dating back to the 90s, the two provinces that have done the least are Alberta and Saskatchewan. So those two provinces are likely to be singled out in terms of their lack of action to actually reduce emissions. And that is also a conversation to have that is based on facts, at least for change, rather than on this policy and whether or not people like it.
Right. And look, Michelle, there's a whole, there are reasons why Alberta and Saskatchewan may be going at a slower rate on hitting the targets than other provinces, because if you just took, say, the 40% reduction everybody wants to hit and applied it equally to every province, you're going to punish their economy in a way they couldn't deal with it in the time frame that's available. So in some ways, this is federalism working for them, and that other provinces absorb larger proportional shares, at least in theory. But when you look at everything that's on the table, from retail carbon pricing to industrial carbon pricing to the methane's reduction and the oil and gas emissions cap, Canada still falls short of its 2030 target. It's within striking distance, but it's not all the way there. So, Michelle, you would need a really aggressive set of subsidies, technology, and regulations to fill in the gap from the loss of retail carbon pricing, and I don't know what the future of industrial carbon pricing is when it comes to a potential future Conservative government right now, because that isn't clear to me. I mean, how much more would you need to do if you're going to hit the targets, or do you just abandon the targets as a national goal?
Well, I think that's a good question for Pierre Poilievre. Like, is he just abandoning the targets? He's been dead silent on that, and you said it very well. There's only so many things that you can do on the big emitters and on some of the other kind of elements of the carbon plan that get you so far. A carbon price has been something that is getting us about 10 to 12% of our way to the goal that we're not quite even meeting yet. So I think that the government is kind of banking on the fact that they have to do something because they're in power and they have to be tackling the climate situation. Again, we're going into wildfire season. It is going to be tough. It is going to be brutal, and there's going to be a lot of Canadians who are impacted. Let's knock wood that there aren't Canadians who are actually losing their homes or losing their businesses or anything like that. That's a result of climate change, and Canadians know that. And I truly feel that they are going to be starting to demand more of their politicians than just saying to axe a tax. Nobody likes paying a tax. There's without question, nobody does. But I think with the campaign ad that Danielle Smith just cut in terms of the rebate, there's at least people that you can point to, and that actually helps to make their point that they are giving this rebate back, and so people are trying to stay whole. Provinces came forward, Fury from Premier Fury came forward with billions of dollars of asks in terms of infrastructure projects, that he thinks that this is the way that he can kind of get rid of the tax in his province and make up the delta. Well, that's just not reasonable. We have to kind of deal with the resource, with certain finite resources, and we can't just leave this problem unsolved. And so, more and more, I think that the pressure is going to be on all the others who are being so glib and just saying, let's axe it because we can do it another way. Okay, so what is that?
Kate, I'm just out of time, but what is your sense of where the federal Conservatives are on any kind of a national policy? Like, do they, it isn't clear to me if they, I know the retail carbon gone. Industrial policy, is that still a thing that they would impose from the federal level, or would they leave it to the provinces to figure it out?
I think they'd probably work with the provinces to figure out what that looks like, as opposed to kind of the 2015 plan, which saw kind of a top-down approach in terms of the federal kind of requirements being imposed upon provinces. I mean, Pierre Poilievre has spoken about the importance of different technology, looking at, diversifying the energy mix by supporting SMR, other things. I'm not sure that things are quite as, substantiated on industrial carbon pricing if that's the direction they choose. But I suspect at the root of it is going to be, how can we work with the provinces to develop something that applies for them? Because again, this dynamic where Ottawa insists that a price is the only solution. A lot of the things you talked about, the alternatives, were tabled in 2015 and 16 when these negotiations were happening, and they were roundly ignored by Ottawa. So provinces are saying, work with us on the alternatives. We've got ideas. And if Ottawa is saying no, I think that's what Canadians are going to remember.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll get all the answers when they have that first ministers meeting that everybody wants, which I don't think is actually going to happen. All right. I want to thank you, gang. Thank you for being here. Emily, Nicola, Michelle Cadario, Françoise Boivin, and Kate Harrison. Thanks so much, gang.